Uh, I'll start by saying that this is, since we're starting the recording, this is the second session in a series of four teachings on the commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on the first Panchen Lama's poem that we're studying, and that is his commentary is in book form, and the book is called Mind of Clear Light: Advice on Living Well and Dying Consciously. And the actual poem that His Holiness is giving us a commentary on by the first Panchen Lama is called Wishes for Release from the Perilous Straits of, sorry, I'm just letting somebody in. The perilous straits of the intermediate state, hero releasing from fright. So it's a little bit of a wordy translation, but as we go through, especially this session, actually the rest of the sessions, that will come into much more focus in terms of what the poem is meant to be as a daily practice, as one would recite, contemplate, and meditate on. But I will start by saying that what we covered last in the first session was foundational, in the sense that we went through the first couple of chapters, the introduction chapters of His Holiness's book, and in that we had laid the groundwork for what we're really doing here. And before I move ahead and continue, I'll just recap by saying that it's meant to give us a view on how we should be living in our life on a daily basis, and including in our daily life a mindfulness practice based on this poem that puts into focus for us what we really should value in life, and more importantly, how that should inspire us to do certain practices, whatever our tradition is. You know, most of us, maybe all of us that are in this session right now, are practicing Buddhists, but I always like to say when I'm teaching a course that one can certainly apply this to whatever your spiritual practice is, or even your religious practice, if we want to use that label. And His Holiness even says that in this text. As this text goes along, he gives summary advice. Those are the words that are used in connection with each stanza that he's presenting a commentary on. So then this is something for you to keep in mind, and I'll try to be mindful as we go through these sessions, especially as I get deeper into describing what we are doing in the actual death process, which comes in the next two sessions, not so much this session. Then that's very much conceptualized within the realm of a specific Buddhist practice. But I'll try to help paint a picture, so to speak, where it can be utilized by really anyone, even someone who isn't a practicing Buddhist. So just for this course, we are focused for this session. We're focused on my goal in this next hour plus is to get through the first 7 actual stanzas of the poem. Again, the first session was a setup for the foundation of sort of putting into focus what I had just said. So the first 7 stanzas, just to remind you of the poem, really explain how to approach dying. And it's not just at the time of death, or when someone knows that they're dying, or we know that someone is a loved one, for example, is dying, and what do we do? But rather, it also includes wherever we are in life. In last session, I talked about how I'm 69 years old, and you could be 69, you could be 79, you could be 85, you can be 20. you're fortunate if you're the younger, the better, because you have a longer period of time to actually do these practices. But that's what these first 7 stanzas are about. They're about practicing, learning how to become mindful of what we need to be doing and practicing on a daily basis, with it in mind that life is impermanent, death is inevitable, sickness, aging, dying, and death are inevitable, and not in a morbid way, but to embrace it and make it a part of life so that we make the most use of this life. So I want you to keep that in mind when we have so many words in this session, especially that talk about dying and death, that it's not meant to be something we should turn away from. And that's very, very important. Um, so the stanzas here start, I'll do a recap and then we'll go into the individual first 7 stanzas. But the first 7 stanzas start with a praise to the origination, if you will, of where this poem comes from through the first Pachan Lama. And I'll get into that in a moment. And then it goes on to talk about a specific practice known as going for refuge. And again, this can be very Buddhist specific, and I'll talk about it in that context, but it can also be related to your own spiritual or religious practice. And then the verses that follow that focus on learning really how to reflect and meditate on impermanence in order to undermine our excessive attachment to what His Holiness calls fleeting appearances. Fleeting appearances being experiences, being like what we normally habitually attach ourselves to in our life and how we live. And adopting that sort of perspective will further discover how that is a skillful tool, specifically, how to actually overcome overwhelming suffering that can accompany any one of our experience at the time of approaching dying and death. So this is where we're going to try to take us up to. And then if I have time today, I'm going to try to take us into a sharp turn, so to speak, where His Holiness then takes all of that information and informs us on how, through the stanzas of the poem, how we can find prescriptive relief on how to achieve a most favorable condition for death and dying, and even while we're dying. And so this is really what we're going to try to cover today. It's an ambitious undertaking, but there's 17 verses. I want to cover all of them through the next 3 sessions. So it's important that I try to move this along quickly. So I'll start right now with the first beginning of the poem, finally. And we're talking about the very first line of the poem, which is where the first Pachan Lama stops and is very mindful of like where this teaching actually comes from, where he says this is in praise of Guru Manjushri. And why does he do that? Because he's acknowledging that this isn't coming from him. This is coming from the Buddha. The Buddha specifically manifested in the form of wisdom. The Buddha's manifestation in the form of wisdom is Manjushri. And Manjushri brings all the Buddha's wisdom in the form of teachings to us as humans. And so as the first Pachan Lama is practicing and writing a poem for us to utilize in a daily practice, he then gives proper, reverence to where this actually originated from. And that's something that was a question that was asked at the end of last session. So I did want to pick up right from there and mention that. And now we'll actually go right into stanza one. Stanza one reads as follows. For those of you who don't have the book, I would read it anyway. It's important to read out loud. I and all beings throughout space and without exception go for refuge until the ultimate of enlightenments to the past, present, and future Buddhas, the doctrine, and the spiritual community. May we be released from the frights of this life, the intermediate state, and the next. So His Holiness starts by telling us that what we're establishing here, no matter what our practice is, even if we're not Buddhist, is that we're acknowledging that through certain commitment to understanding the suffering existence that we live in, and in Buddhism, that comes to us through the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth being the suffering quality that life presents to us. And what the rest of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths brings forth is that we have the capacity to work with ourselves in the human form to alleviate that suffering. And so establishes what His Holiness calls an attitude of self-help. We're not helpless. We're not powerless. We don't have to go through living with the anticipation of sickness, dying, death. And for us practicing Buddhists, the cycle of life that continues from there in the intermediate state and then rebirth and then on and on and on, repeated through the 12 links of dependent origination. So in going for refuge to our spiritual practice, we, in this context, go to what is called in Buddhism the three jewels being the Buddha himself. And again, in this context, we're talking about the Buddha in the form of Manjushri's wisdom. And then further, that we are developing practices based on his teachings, which is the doctrine, obviously. And then finally, we're going for refuge to the community of practicing Buddhists that already have this in their mental continuum, if you will, meaning these practices based on the Buddha's teachings, and that we take and have faith in that there's something here that we can also utilize to bring forth in our own practice to actualize the same state that the spiritual community has reached based on the Buddha's teachings, which are the doctrines. So this is called causal refuge. You're taking refuge and having faith in that three aspects of where these teachings come from, which is the Buddha, the teachings themselves, which we call in this poem the doctrines, and then looking at the spiritual community that's already realized it. And then we're asking here for their compassion, meaning to not generate compassion in them. They don't need that. It's rather, and this is important, because I think a lot of us don't stop and think about what compassion really means in terms of receiving compassion from the Buddhas or from whatever our spiritual practice might point us towards. But rather here, it's His Holiness says that rather this is not generating compassion in those objects. It's opening us up ourselves to compassion. That's what really is happening here when we go for refuge. And further, going for refuge, in this way, we also are making part of the wish that we ourselves eventually become a member of that spiritual community through the doctrine or through the Dharma or through the teachings, if you will, of the Buddha. And that is called the resultant refuge. So this works in the context of cause and effect. We have causal refuge that we go for to the Buddha, the doctrine, and the spiritual community. And that's our wish as I described it. But we make sure that we include in that wish that our goal isn't just to go for refuge there, but is to actually become a member of that spiritual community. And His Holiness calls that in the text the resultant refuge. So I always like to talk about both because sometimes, I don't know about you, but I know sometimes it's easy to forget that that's really what refuge is. And His Holiness further goes on to say that about this verse, that it's really hard to practice the kind of spiritual practices that we have without going for refuge. Geshe Darge taught years ago in one of the first teachings I had with him almost 20 years ago, that if you don't truly go for refuge in the three jewels, then no matter what your practices are, no matter how much you know, no matter how many texts you memorize and have insight into, then you're not really a Buddhist. So going for refuge is foundational. That's why the first Panchen Lamba includes it here. But again, if you're not a practicing Buddhist, you can apply this to your own spiritual practice or religious practice and take it to heart in the same way. Without having that kind of commitment to your practice, then it's difficult. His Holiness uses an example from Buddhism where somebody who might be reciting a mantra, and he uses the famous mantra of Om Pat Mani Padme Hum, which is the mantra of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion. And it's meant to, as you repeat it, to invoke compassion. But he basically says that, you need to manifest that in connection with, in the context of having taken refuge within the spiritual community based on refuge in the three jewels. So basically, you really want to conjoin any practice that you'd undertake with refuge. And further, you heard me talk about this in the last session, you should further try to conjoin that with not only for reaching your own benefit, but for reaching the benefit of all sentient beings. Reaching meaning having the wish to have reached that resultant stage yourself of becoming a member of the spiritual community who actually realizes liberation, realizes enlightenment. In Buddhism, we call that reaching Buddhahood or a state of omniscience. And why do we want to do that? So that we can also then, in that state, help all other sentient beings. And in that way, we become a member of the spiritual community in that resultant refuge. So this is something that starts us off, and it's meant to give us, especially as practicing Buddhists, a strong foundation to stand on for everything we're going to further explore, meditate on, and hopefully develop other practices based on this poem. So the summary advice, His Holiness gives summary advice connected to each verse in this teaching. The summary advice for this verse is that you should try to motivate your practice by doing it for the benefit of all beings, and that he underscores also, remember that early comment I made right after I read the verse, that the whole attitude of a Buddhist practitioner is that, help yourself. And what he says here in the summary advice is that the Buddhas are teachers. They can show you the spiritual path. They can teach you specifics. That's the doctrine. But they don't give you realizations. Well, like a gift, you have to practice. So that's the whole reason we're here in this session, right? We have to practice. If we don't do a practice, then nothing's really going to happen. So from here, His Holiness moves into a commentary on the second stanza. And this is under chapter 3 in the book, which is called Preparing to Die. And remember, don't think of it as something that is like right when you're going to die or a loved one's going to die. This is something, as we're all here, hopefully, in this session, we're relatively healthy mentally and with in mind and body as well. And we should utilize these what this poem and His Holiness's commentary has to teach us now. So this chapter starts with a quote actually by the Buddha, which is meant to lead us into the second stanza. And that quote by the Buddha is, "Not knowing that I must leave everything and depart, I did various ill deeds for the sake of friends and foes." And we'll get into explaining that as we move along. The actual second stanza or verse to the first Panchen Lama's poem is as follows: "May we extract the meaningful essence of this life support without being distracted by the senseless affairs of this life, since this good foundation, hard to gain and easy to disintegrate, presents an opportunity of choice between profit and loss, comfort and misery." So what the Buddha's quote and also the first Panchen Lama's poem here basically is telling us is that, hey, you have been born as a human being with certain mental capacities of mind and physical capacities of body. So we call them the internal and external two capacities that we have gained, that we need to take advantage of them in order to gain liberation from this suffering existence, remembering the Buddha's first noble truth. And that if we allow ourselves to be sucked into the daily activities of life, normal life, that are not mindful of virtuous activities, especially those built on compassion, then we're going to clutter our lives on a daily basis in such a way that we get swept away. And this is something that we have uniquely available to us, meaning the Buddha's teachings, the doctrine that we talked about in the first verse. And we have the ability to exert ourselves and not waste our time with daily concerns of this life. It doesn't mean we don't take care of ourselves in this life. It's by taking care of ourselves and our loved ones around us in this life that we're able to do that. So when we read His Holiness's text, do that, meaning do these practices. When we read this His Holiness's text, we don't want to look at it in sort of a black and white way, like one or the other. I can attest to this. I mean, I'm a regular person living in America, meaning I'm married. I've been married for almost 50 years. I have 4 children. I provided substantially for them along with my wife in a practical, normal way. But what I developed over years of practice following this kind of teaching that we're giving here in this course is to put that in perspective and not to value that above all else, and not to value that in a way that sacrifices having access to and developing a spiritual life based on the kinds of teachings that are available to us in various spiritual practices, including Buddhism. His Holiness talks about how that's unique to us. Animals can't do that. Other sentient beings can't do that in the realm of suffering existence. So he also underscores, and this is underscored in many texts. I think I mentioned this last week, that we can read a similar and reflect on a similar teaching in the Lamrim Chimo by Jason Kappa, where those steps on the path, Lamrim Chimo, steps on the path, the great path, really start with having an appreciation for our precious human life. and we can blow it. We can really blow it if we do not um, take advantage of it, where we utilize having access to these kinds of teachings that are available to us in our various spiritual practices, especially in this context of this poem, pointed at awareness of what's to come in the cycle of life, which is death, dying, death, intermediate state, and rebirth. So these are all part of remembering to keep that in focus as we look to build the foundation in these early verses of what we should have an appreciation of. His Holiness then goes on to talk further about how the existence of having this life that we have as a human in body and mind is built on causes and conditions. It's always important to keep that in mind from a Buddhist point of view, and how we're connected to everything, everywhere, all the time, throughout all of existence, and how that's a reflection on the true nature of everything being changeable. He says we don't just come from our mother and father's joining together of ovum and sperm. That had to come from the conjoining of other people, if we look at just our family history. And then even when we go back to the beginning of the world, he says, he's talking about existence, like the Big Bang. He said there's literally no ovum and sperm there. So there has to be other factors, cause and effect factors that were involved in that. And he labels that as karma. And it's important for us to keep cause and effect in our minds when we talk about the effectiveness of maybe taking on practices that can affect, plant seeds, imprints in our mind to change, to move forward. He talks about every world system being made up of eras of formation, continuation, disintegration, and finally a period of voidness. He's talking about all of existence. And the period of voidness is always followed then by the formation of energy. And that energy comes from all the physical elements, but that energy gathers up all the physical elements that exist, but it comes from a subtle energy of our karmic ripenings, what we call projecting karma. And that's how things work on the grandest of schemes in terms of all sentient beings that exist. So he's making a case here for like buying into causes and conditions being how everything works. And he's also, in this section of the book, he's talking about we could either see that that's how everything works, meaning based on karmic formations, our former actions, which are the causes, ripening into results or effects, or we could see that all of existence has come into existence through a creator. And in Buddhism, there's a case to be made that everything comes from causes and conditions since beginningless time, meaning it's always been that way, because everything comes from the nature of changeability, causes and conditions, not from something that's permanent, that has no cause. From a Buddhist point of view, something coming from an entity that's permanent, let's say a creator, that is impermanent, that's not possible. It's not logical. So he does talk about that. But the main thrust there is not to criticize religious or spiritual practices that are based on the concept of a creator or God, and it doesn't negate that either. That's not the intent. We're just talking about how things work. And what's important to understand that from a Buddhist point of view, because things are changeable and don't have permanence, and that they only arise moment by moment from previous causes, we have the ability to change them. So again, as this poem and this practice and these reflections that are being built up here through these verses are formed and put together, we have to keep in mind that we, again, in that attitude of self-help, that the going for refuge prayer in the first verse gives us, it's meant to give us confidence that because things work that way on the basis of karma, because everything is impermanent and changeable, we have the ability to change things. And he says that this doesn't just apply to world systems, it applies to us as individual sentient beings. And that means that we, knowing that, should partake in activities that are virtuous and can accumulate from a causal point of view. Good deeds that will produce good results. And so it's a very logical system. And for those of you who've studied karma and how cause and effect work and conditioned reality works, then we don't need to spend too much time on this. But if you haven't spent that much time on this, it's really important. It's why in this text, His Holiness takes many pages to talk about this, because it's foundational. Foundational in the sense that without understanding this is how things work, we could sort of miss why it's so important to take our time moment by moment in our daily lives to live in a way where we're creating the causes for future good results. And he talks about how if we don't do that, conversely, we're creating conditions for bad results. And this is really important to underscore. He says this is part of the reason why, since in Buddhist context, since beginningless time, we've been creating bad results based on not properly understanding how things really work. And through that mistaken way of not seeing how things really work, meaning through how things really work through causes and conditions. And if you're going to do something that is self-cherishing, you're going to end up with a suffering result. And if you do something that's based on the opposite of that, you're going to have a result that is good. He underscores how this is very fragile. Even though we have this human life, it's very fragile. It's hard to find. Bad activities that we might engage in will produce strong non-virtuous states of mind. We call them mental afflictions, anger, jealousy, hatred, all kinds of negative emotions. And conversely, if we partake in strong virtuous actions, these will ripen into strong, overpowering potencies that have a good quality, and that in effect will prevent bad results from essentially ripening and taking place. So there's a real tangible reason to partake in virtuous activity versus non-virtuous activity as an antidote to ending non-virtuous activities, and gaining that state that the first Panchen Lama talks about in the first verse, which is becoming a member of that spiritual community, again, through the studying and practicing the doctrines. And he underscores that becoming a human is a very difficult state to achieve. It is very, very hard because we have this tendency to partake in life in this way that is not necessarily producing good results. And that's all based on some things we'll talk about over the next couple of verses. And here I'll just say that he goes on to say that one of the other benefits of practicing with this kind of a mind, with this kind of attitude of wanting to develop virtuous qualities, is that it creates in one's day-to-day, moment-by-moment existence a tamed mind. Attained mind has the qualities of peace, um, uh, wanting to love, care, and take care of not only ourselves, but others. And this is a really desirable effect to have. Less chaotic, less untamed is the word that he uses. Um, so this is the idea. And he tries to also underscore that, if we are fooled into thinking that life has um, happiness in form of pleasures that are we know as being ordinary for either our body and mind or emotions. Um, he underscores that we should take time out to reflect on how all of those are not they're not permanent. They're transitory, just like everything else. You might have momentary happiness, um, but it's always going to be followed by something that's not that. Sadness, pain, maybe even eventually death and dying. And that could be physical or mental. He quotes from um, Aryadeva's 400 stanzas on yogic deeds of the Bodhisattva. And he says in that verse that once the body um, depends on the four elements, meaning what we're made up of, earth, fire, wind, and water, um, all of those elements, if you think about them just in an ordinary way, they they oppose each other. They all have different qualities, and one wants to be dominate over the other, if you will. It happens in just here on planet Earth all the time. Those kinds of opposing forces are banging into each other, if you will. And occasionally they work in harmony. Um, when you have a beautiful, like we did here the last couple of days in New Jersey, we had beautiful sunny days and the temperature was really nice for the winter. And there was no wind or very little wind and everything was in harmony. But that changed. There's a big storm coming the day after tomorrow. Nothing ever stays perfect, even in the most wonderful environments that exist on the planet, like in the Caribbean and Hawaii and in other places. Um, and we know that, just, we can recall those for ourselves. And the same thing with mental states. His Holiness talks about how the happiness of mind is something that is going to be a temporary balancing of everything just sort of being like a perfect day. It never lasts. And he says that's the kind of problems we have with our bodies in the human form. They're really wonderful to have, especially combined with a good solid mind, but that it's fragile. Fragile, especially in the sense that we don't get to live forever. The body is going to die, and the potency for doing good activities will fade with it. So he's urging us to take up, with that in mind, take up trying to root our happiness in also not just our own happiness, but the welfare of others in the development of having attained mind. So this is all part of what he goes through regarding this verse. And he said, by doing this, we can extract the meaningful essence of this precious and tenuous human body. And his summary advice here has 4 points. Realize the value of a human body, which you've been endowed, and that it's the result of many past good causes, as I was talking about with how karma works, and appreciate the fact that there are teachings available to you and practices, spiritual practices, that can help you make the best use of it. And since this precious human life is point number 2, is so powerfully beneficial or can be very destructive if you don't use it properly, makes good sense to start using it well now. There's a sense of urgency, no matter what your age is. And then he talks about what I was just talking about, the physical and mental happiness that we might experience in this life is temporary. based on that occasional balance of um, everything being just right. And then he talks about our goal should be having a tame mind to reach a peaceful, relaxed, and happy state where we can really make our goal not only temporary happiness, but our goal would be to reach that state in a permanent way, not just for ourselves, but for all others. So from there, he goes into stanza 3. And stanza 3 reads as follows. May we realize that there is no time to waste. So he's trying to give us a sense of urgency now. Death being definite, by the time of death, but the time of death indefinite. What is gathered will separate. What has been accumulated will be consumed without residue. He's talking literally about our physical and mental self. At the end of a rising comes descent, and finally birth, and the finality of birth is death. So he's talking about how everything isn't permanent, and it's an illusion to think that things are anything other than that, and that the main way to create in a daily practice an awareness of that is not only understanding what this verse is telling us, but to try to maybe develop a practice that will help us sort of keep that presence in mind. And His Holiness gives us a very specific practice when it comes to that. I'm going to put it on the screen. Chopal, I assume I can share the screen, right?
You can, yes.
Okay, so let me just find that. I gotta bring that up. Be with you in a second. So this document here, that hopefully you can all see, I tried to put it in big type, is called Death and Impermanence. And this is a meditation, an analytical meditation that His Holiness gives us to help us understand and embrace death and impermanence in the form of a contemplation, and then further bringing that into meditation and having resolve. And it's called the 3 roots, 9 reasons, and 3 resolves. The first root is contemplate that death is definite. And then the meditation is because death will definitely come and therefore cannot be avoided. Because our lifespan cannot be extended and diminishes increasingly. Because even when we are alive, there is little time to practice. Then our resolve should be, I must practice. And he's talking about specific spiritual practices that will be beneficial to not only our life now, but our life in the future, including death, dying, and rebirth. And then the second root is contemplating that the time of death is indefinite, because our lifespan in this world is indefinite, because the causes of death are very many and the causes of life are few, and because the time of death is uncertain due to the fragility of the body. Our resolve, it should be, I must practice now. So not only as the first one reaches a conclusion that I must practice, but it's that I must practice now. And then the third root is contemplate that at the time of death, nothing helps except practice. And this really will get to where we move in all our future verses in this poem. So because at the time of death, our friends, I should say friends, not friend, friends are no help. And it's not like friends aren't present to us and helping us, but they can't come with us and they can't guide us as we go through the actual dying process, which we're going to learn about in detail in following verses. And because at the time of death, our wealth is of no help, we can't bring in, we could be the richest person on earth like Elon Musk, and he can't bring a penny with him. And it isn't going to benefit him in where his consciousness moves to as it leaves this life. And because at the time of death, our body is of no help, well, you know, that's pretty obvious in the sense of like what happens when we die. Our body basically gives out on us, abandons us. So our resolve should be, I will practice non-attachment to any of the wonderful, that's said sort of tongue in cheek, wonderful things of this life. So, the idea here is to work with this simple contemplation to urge us on a daily level to become mindful that not in a morbid way, but because death is something that is inevitable, we don't know when it's going to happen. And then all of the other things that are talked about in that 9 reasoning unfolding that we just went through. And I'll send a copy of this around to all the people I know, and also Gloria will put it at the listing for the course on the DNKL website. And there'll be a few others by the time we get to the end of this course that I'll put up there. So this is one of the things that His Holiness gives us during this commentary on the poem, is to give us something to work with so that we don't take for granted where we are today, alive, healthy, and capable of being able to take advantage of this precious human life. And he has many, many pages in the book that talk about the specifics wrapped around what these 9 reasonings present in this contemplation. And we don't have time to go through all of them. But I think it's important that if you can, try to read the book and take them in a little bit more detail, and try to practice this particular meditation. If you do, when you get to the point where you're able to recite this poem, all 17 verses, which only takes a few minutes a day, when you get to this verse, it will have much more depth of meaning. His Holiness then also goes on to talk about the benefits of thinking about death. There are lots of benefits because if we don't think about it, we're not going to be prepared for it. I know many people in my life, I talked a little bit about this last session, who they let death and dying comes upon them or a loved one, and they're not prepared, and helplessness and fear overtake them. And there are other people who ignore that that's what's actually happening. They can't actually even face it. I can tell you without giving you details, but I can give you just my own example of that in my family. My father was a very, very loving husband, and he was a very, very loving father. He was also very religious, and he's taught me over my lifetime so many things. But one of the things many, many years ago, my mother was quite young when she became terminally ill. And out of love, he shielded that from his 5 children and would never talk about it, and would never bring it into focus where we as children had an opportunity, along with my mother and with him, to engage in being part of her sickness, her actual then, dying process. And this was an opportunity lost. And if you reflect back on what I talked about last session, where I gave you some examples of the editor of this book, Jeffrey Hopkins, talking about his mom and his dad when they passed, and his cousin and his friend. He gave us a number of examples. He had the opportunity to help all of them. None of them were Buddhists, by the way, but he was able to use his Buddhist practice to help them and to be present to them. And so I'm not saying anything in a negative or um, uh, negative emotional intent towards giving you that example about my father. His motivation and intent was good, but it was erroneous. And so there's lots of benefits to making this part of your practice, because when we talk about death and we talk about dying and we talk about sickness, we should be able to approach it where it isn't just uncomfortable. It isn't filled with fear. It isn't filled with the kinds of emotions that are harmful. So His Holiness tries to tell us that, like, there's actually a lot of great benefit to thinking about death and then actually being comfortable with it for not only yourself, but for your loved ones around you. So his summary advice on this verse is as follows. He says, if you cultivate a sense of uncertainty of the time of death, you will make better use of your time. Here he's talking about how, and I talked a little bit about this last week, it should create that sort of sense of urgency that now's the time to make better use of your time. And specifically, the Panchen Lama and His Holiness here are recommending specific practices that are virtuous, that can lead to a better future existence, both in this life and in the next. So he says this also prevents procrastination, which I basically was just talking about. And he then says, really realizing that no matter how wonderful a situation may be, meaning how you're living, and I do hope that all of you have not so much of a challenging reality day to day, where it's really, really difficult. But by the fact that you might have this wonderful situation, meaning a human life and time to practice, then being in this place where you can partake in these kinds of teachings, then it's a good thing and you shouldn't take it for granted. And do not think that there will be time later. There will not be time later. And that's one, if you procrastinate, then when the time comes when you are facing sickness, dying, and death, then these kinds of things can overwhelm you because you're unprepared. And the last point, which I talked about in the example with my mother and father, be frank about facing your own death. Skillfully encourage others to be frank about their death. Do not deceive each other with compliments when time of death is near. Honesty will foster courage and joy. He means compliments, meaning like, oh, you're going to be okay, and you're going to get better, and you're strong, and blah, da, 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 da. Those are all not really pointing where you could be present to others in the right direction. So now we move to the stanza 4, and this is the beginning of chapter 4, which is called Removing Obstacles to a Favorable Death. So this is where we want to really start to look at what can we do? What can we actually do to improve what we're all eventually going to face? So he starts with a Buddhist quote: though you hold fast, you cannot stay. What benefit is there in being frightened and scared of what is unalterable? He's basically saying, like, there's nothing to be afraid of. You can't stay here. Death and dying, sickness, dying, and death is part of life. And so embrace it and don't be afraid of it. It's unalterable. And the first Panchen Lama's 4th stanza reads as follows: may we be relieved from overwhelming suffering due to the various causes of death. When in this city of erroneous concepts of subject and object, the illusory body composed of the 4 impure elements and consciousness are about to separate. So here he's talking about um, gaining familiarity with actual virtuous states, which would then direct the mind. If you practice well, will direct the mind to be in a virtuous state, even when you're actually dying, this is something that even Buddhist practitioners that I know, because I've had many conversations, I'm using quotes here, are afraid of. Even though I do all these practices, what will happen when I actually die? Can I have my practices help me gain a virtuous state of being when I die? And it is important to try to make that a goal. Because when you die, as I talked about last time in the first session, you can easily be overwhelmed. And that could be through really normal things that happen when many of us die, through pain from a terrible illness, um, suffering of an untimely death in an accident, right? Or from an attack, maybe a heart attack. Um, or you may not be able, to finish your lifespan due to your exhaustion of merit. His Holiness says that. And that, again, is hearkening back to cause and effect. We have gained this precious human life based on previous virtuous activity. Maybe then the exhaustion of merit happens sooner than we would expect. This goes to the point of we never know when we are going to die. We know we're going to die, but we never know when it's going to be. And often, unfortunately, if we look at the panorama of all sentient beings' lifespans, many sentient beings, including humans, die way too early, and they don't even have the opportunity to practice. A stillborn infant, a child dying of childhood leukemia at 5 years old. I can go on with an infinite amount of examples. So it isn't a given that everybody who's human has the opportunity to do these kinds of practices. But it underscores for the Panchen Lama and His Holiness how it makes it that much more important to develop virtuous activities now. So, he says further that, the goal here at a minimum, by doing these kinds of practices, is to have oneself and be present to others who might be dying, like Jeffrey Hopkins gave us his examples at the beginning, in a way that's relaxed, peaceful, and helpful. Having virtuous attitudes present in your moment by moment experience will be beneficial to yourself and others, much more so than if you were frantic, mentally speaking and emotionally speaking, because you had no grounding in certain understandings about the death and dying process and the virtuous activities that might accompany preparing properly for that time, again, for yourself and others. And then His Holiness moves into talking about how important it is for when there's a separation of body and mind, when one is dying, actually going through the death process, and then after death, that we have an understanding of how things really are. He calls that realizing the nature of I. Again, I'm using quotes for those of you who can't see me on the screen. And this is understanding our collection of physical and mental aggregates, and how in the collection that we've taken in this form as I, as me, as mine, is impure. It's produced by the four elements, and is subject to pain and the slightest causes. And it is like an illusion, he says. And so this has been labeled by the Panchen Lama so beautifully in this verse as the city of misconceptions. He's talking about how we view ourselves normally as inherently self-existing, and our environment and all phenomena and others as inherently self-existing. And he calls that the city of misconceptions. mistaking the nature of consciousness and its objects, meaning those things that, as we're a conscious individual human being, we're engaging in others and things, how we engage with them. He calls it the city of erroneous conceptions. And that's referring to, in Buddhism, we call that samsara, all suffering existence, all cyclic existence. Cyclic meaning it's the 12 links of dependent origination going on and on and on. And this is all built on the action of karma under the influence of afflictive emotions, which all come from the conception of everything inherently existing. That's the ignorance. That's the lack of wisdom. And remember, this verse is substantially based, this poem, not just this verse, is substantially rooted and based on the wisdom of the Buddha, of Manjushri. And so we need to reflect and contemplate on the I, how it is a false understanding of how things really work, thinking that everything inherently exists. I inherently exist, so all other things inherently exist, instead of just understanding that everything only exists in dependence on arising moment by moment with each other. And by grasping onto things as if they inherently self-exist, that motivates actions, karmic actions of self-grasping to things that we like and pushing away things that we don't like. And that creates those negative predispositions, those seeds that are planted in our subtle consciousness that we carry forth with us that will eventually ripen. And by doing that, we are stuck in the city of misconceptions endlessly. And that's what causes suffering. Not seeing the object of what we're apprehending at any given moment, and ourselves, and the act of actually apprehending as simply being just that. It's just arising. There isn't anything else going on. Other conditions that are these kinds of conditions that are going on in our minds moment by moment are the root problem. And this is what is labeled in Buddhist practice as the three poisons. And those of you who are familiar with the Buddha's Wheel of Life can recall that. And I taught a class 3 or 4 years ago called Wake Up Now. And it was all about understanding how the Wheel of Life works, all generated from the three poisons, and trying to create antidotes to that. So His Holiness's summary advice here on stanza 4 is, practice now that at the time of death, the force of your familiarity with virtue will affect your attitude. And then number 2, his summary advice is view the body as this veritable city of misconceptions that I was just talking about. He says further, people and things appear to exist under their own power, and ignorance accepts that false appearance, giving rise to the afflictive emotions of desire, hatred, and just more bewilderment of like, why do things happen the way they do? These afflictive emotions in turn pollute actions of body, speech, and mind, and they perpetuate the suffering existence cycle of life. And understanding that you live in this city of misconceptions and being comfortable with that, but then doing something about it is what this verse is all about. The next verse is stanza 5. And it reads as follows: may we be relieved from mistaken appearances of non-virtue. When deceived at the time of need by this body sustained so dearly, the frightful enemies, the lords of death, manifest, and we kill ourselves with the weapons of the three poisons of desire, hatred, and bewilderment. So I had just mentioned those three poisons in the last at the end of the last verse. So, what's being underscored here is understanding um, how things really exist. And this really means taking some time to do some meditation on the true nature of the self, which is a fundamental practice in Buddhism, that it's empty of inherent self-existence. You don't have to live in that city of misconceptions. Yes, you do have to sustain your body. You do have to sustain it with food and clothes, money, shelter, medicines, but you don't want to get attached to those things. They're going to abandon you at the time of death. Remember the meditation that we did earlier, or that I walked through on death. So, these are the frightful aspects that the Panchen Lama is talking about here. When we grasp onto those things of life that we hold to be permanent and self-existent at the time of death, when death actually becomes manifest as a process, the frightful aspects of impermanence, seeing that these things don't exist permanently, that you don't exist, especially the I doesn't exist. Like, you could say that, I could say it, but if we don't really meditate on it and understand it and ideally experience things in that way, that things only arise in dependence on each other and don't have any inherent self-existence, we're going to still be caught up in experiencing things, even if mentally you think otherwise, as things having permanence. And that's what the frightful aspects that arise at the time of death actually are. And in the poem, the first Panchen Lama calls those frightful aspects of impermanence, realizing that everything is really impermanence and you've been holding on to them inappropriately throughout your whole life, valuing them, harming people in the process and benefiting yourself in the process. Those are the lords of death in the poem. Having that strong attachment to possessions and even relatives and friends and body. Not that you don't love relatives, friends, and your own self and don't take care of them, but you don't do it based on a lack of wisdom, living in that city that we talked about earlier in the last verse. So these three poisons are really what permeate our life experience and that we need to become aware of. And it's this kind of practice of understanding the true nature of I, the sooner the better, so that when dying and the death process actually arise, we'll be able to identify these all of existence and all of the impermanent arisings that occur without having present to us the lords of death, those frightful realizations that come upon someone. And when we don't do that, the verse talks about that being a state where we're remaining in and living in that ignorance. Then, when the time of death happens, we, in a very deeper sense, which we're going to explore when we get into later verses, we literally, in a deeper sense, the verse says, these are weapons with which you kill yourself at death, because you're remaining in a state where you're mistakenly holding on to things as inherently self-existing. You're hanging on to ignorantly seeing things, lacking the wisdom of seeing how things really, really arise moment by moment. So really, that's one of the main obstacles. So that even when His Holiness earlier talked about the what happens sometimes in this life, where one might die suddenly of, say, a heart attack or in a car accident. If you've been practicing, if you've been practicing virtuous activities, especially of developing compassion and developing wisdom, which this verse and this poem is based on, you will be in a position where those lords of death don't necessarily have to arise in such a frightful way. Even in those conditions, ideally, we want to die a normal death where it's happening slowly and we go through what are called the 8 stages of the dissolution at death, which we'll talk about next week. So, but there's, there is benefit to practicing no matter what. And then the last thing His Holiness talks about in this chapter is that it's important, he says, at the time of death, if possible, this is a really tough one for the age that we live in, to be free from medicines that would make you unable to think properly. This would be anything that dulls your mind. And the reasons, if you've been listening to what I've been talking about, is that you want to be mentally sharp if you're in a state where that's possible, based on imprints you've created earlier, before you're dying, based on virtuous activities that we've been talking about. You want them to be present. You want them to be something that can arise. So the idea, he says, of an injection to allow a peaceful death could deprive the mind of the opportunity of manifesting in a virtuous way by reflecting on impermanence. He's talking about at the time of death, generating faith, feeling compassion, or meditating on selflessness, which is what I was just talking about a moment ago. So he does say, though, however, if there are painkillers that could be available to you that don't dull your mind, then that would be ideal. So I kind of just have to leave that there, because we all know many people in our lives who have had to be on pain medications to help them during the time of death. But ideally, it's something that if you're present to someone who's dying, if they and you have some say in it, if it's possible, you want to try to encourage that not to be something that's happening. But this is a tough one. That's a really tough one, which can be part of further discussion. So his summary advice on this verse is, understand that this body which you sustain at any cost, which we all tend to do, will someday desert you. Avoid desiring after situations you are going to be leaving. Avoid hating that you have to leave. So you shouldn't have regret about dying. You should be able to go forward into the death and dying process with a peaceful mind, and keep away from desiring, hatred, and ignorance, which is what we were just talking about, the 3 poisons, as much as possible, so you can maintain virtuous practice while dying. And then number 5, realize that by taking a medication that might dull your mind, this could affect maximizing what you could experience in a positive way as you go through the death process. So these are some of the things that we want to talk and think about as we ponder and review these verses in more depth. I wanted to go through the next chapter, but we don't have enough time today, especially if people want to ask a few questions. And the next chapter, by the way, is called Gaining Favorable Conditions for the Time of Death, and they would be covering stanzas 6 and 7. But I sort of feel that I should stop right now, and we can talk about stanzas 6 and 7 in the beginning of the next session. And then from there, I would follow that literally into the following verses, which give us actual techniques for how to meditate while we're actually dying. So up to now, we've been talking about what we can do to adjust our mental attitude in preparation for the time of death, of sickness, aging, sickness, dying, and death, and then using that as a motivator, an internal motivator to move forward to do certain practices. The most important ones are doing meditation practices that give us a sense of the presence of impermanence, which then lead directly into based on understanding impermanence, then how are things really? Things are they lack inherent self-existence. The I doesn't exist the way it does. All other things don't exist the way we think they do. And those create the imprints. Those kinds of meditations create the imprints to put your mind in a better place when you approach aging, sickness, dying, and death. And then, as we'll go into through the rest of the next two sessions, there's further practices you can then specifically do that you can be mindful of when you're actually going through the dying process that will be beneficial for you, whether you believe in reincarnation and the cycle of existence in the form of the 12 links of dependent origination, or you have a different belief system where that's not necessarily the case. The next session will be talking about specific techniques we can use in that regard. So a lot to cover, some hopefully things I covered clearly enough, but I certainly would like to take the last 10 minutes and answer any questions that anybody has or comments. They don't even have to be questions, or you can share with us an experience that's based on some of the things I talked about.
I have a question, and this has to go back to what you just talked about, which is kind of a deeper conversation that I think you said that we might want to have later down the road. But what about people that have to take medications for like anxiety or things like that, right? Because some people do have to take medications, for certain things, right? Like that are necessary. And I guess what I'm saying is, how do you look upon those things? Because in one sense, a doctor or someone would say, well, it's necessary for you. You may not agree with it, but you know that if you don't take it, you may have some really poor results health wise, and so like for people like that, I think it's a struggle. And how would you work with that and overcome that? I think, you can, like you were saying, you could practice meditation every day. And you could try to follow the best you can. But how would the Buddha, or how would the practice view that?
Yeah, it's pretty tricky, but on a certain level, it's not tricky. It's that these moment by moment arisings of actually take an individual who gets sick. That's their karmic ripening, and that at that time, the only way to help them stay alive and relatively healthy. Again, we're talking about like a singular model here. It varies as much as there are, as many human beings there are on the planet in terms of specifics, right? So like this is a big generalization, but one has to, as a Buddhist practitioner especially, and one who may have been practicing doing these kinds of practices, ideally before one gets sick and might be in a condition such as you're describing, you've planted the seeds that even if you're taking medications like that, they will have more of a challenge to ripen during the death process. There are certain karmic ripenings that happen during the death process, which and then shortly thereafter, which we'll get into next week, which is called projecting karma. That will still happen, but to maximize the benefit of those practices will be affected by medication. That's what His Holiness is saying. But one has to, in an individual situation, balance from a compassionate point of view the value of alleviating physical pain, and maybe in the case you're talking about, like somebody who's taking medications for relief of mental afflictions like anxiety, or depression, or maybe something even more severe like personality disorder or borderline schizophrenia. I mean, these require really powerful drugs in the day and age that we live. You have to take them on an individual basis, and you have to skillfully, if you're a person who's actually going through those, that's one thing. And then if you're advising somebody who maybe it's a family member or dear friend who is going through that and it isn't you, you try to start as early on in the life cycle that you're in or you're in with that friend to help influence them and get them to partake in virtuous activities, virtuous meditations, if that's possible for them even. I have a family member who can't meditate. I have two family members who can't meditate because of suicidal ideation that occurs when they try to meditate. So, what do you do there? Um, with one of those family members, I've tried to create alternative meditative practices that don't require them to go into what you and I might think of as a meditation. That they do exist, that are within the bounds of being helpful to them. So, the answers to your questions are, from a consulting and advising point of view, are as varied as the individual and cannot be prescribed in a definitive way. All I can say is that you try to take the teachings that you might have available to you and apply them in a compassionate way to yourself or to others where you have an awareness to the degree that it's possible to benefit them. And it's all relative. We live in samsara, suffering existence, and it can't be something that is like fully ideal. His Holiness says if you can avoid that, good. If you can't, then you work with it as best you can. And that's part of the suffering existence that we live in. And the most important thing is to stay as compassionate as possible to yourself if it's you going through it, and mindful of practices if you are mentally capable and emotionally capable, and ditto as you might be trying to aid and abet someone in your life. So, individual situations might require sort of further consultation with like a teacher and maybe with health professionals working together. And I hope in the future that health professionals can embrace spiritual teachers who can help synthesize into the death, the aging, sickness, and dying process for individuals, a way to maximize both medical and spiritual practices for the good of that individual. We're obviously not there, and it's a long way to go, but there are efforts being made in that regard. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has made efforts for a couple of decades now in that regard. And so there's movement in the right direction, but we're not really where we need to be in that regard either. So hopefully that helps to a little degree. Okay, any other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Got to be a few.
One in the chat. I just put a thought in the chat.
Oh, go ahead, Marcella.
I guess I could read it.
Oh, yeah. I can read it if you
yes,
want. Yeah. Okay. So in the chat, it's someone asks, I struggle sometimes to reconcile non-attachment to our situation, i.e. loved ones, while nourishing and relishing this precious human life. Cultivating compassion and presence and love as important, while connecting to the notion that at the time of death, those friends cannot help us. That's in quotes, cannot help us. I understand this intellectually, but how to love deeply, which is pointed towards by the impermanence of this life, and while separating from attachment. So it's hard. It's very hard. Developing non-attachment to loved ones doesn't mean not caring for them deeply at every moment, right through through the most crucial and emotionally challenging and intense moments of death. But if you can practice non-attachment in the sense of self-cherishing them in a way that is uninformed, meaning you want to hold on to them for selfish reasons, in that will be of benefit to you, and not with the awareness of like how things really are, how things really arise moment by moment, and how as they're dying, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, being present to somebody like that and letting go of them in a informed, wisdom-filled way is beneficial to them to move on to a better life of what's to come after death, whatever your belief system. These are kind of practices you have to do now to sort of be an antidote to that, not an antidote to deep, loving, holding dearly those loved ones in your life, but how you do it and how wisdom-filled are you in how you hold them and how you then also let go of them. And this is not easy, which is why the Panchen Lama's poem and then also His Holiness's commentary is say, be aware of these things now and do them now. Practice impermanence, but also combined with the wisdom of understanding the lack of inherent existence. Hopefully that helps a little bit, Marcella. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions today? I packed a lot in today, but it was I didn't even finish as much as I wanted to. So the comment, one other comment by John D. Says the brain is a physical thing and can be broken. I would think there are many instances where meditation would not be possible without something like a medication to address a physical chemical issue, making it too difficult. Without, I just want to read that again. I would think there are many instances where meditation would not be possible without something like, would not be possible without like medication to address a physical. I agree, and I have people in my life where not just we're talking about like at the time of dying, or aging, or where they're maybe in some form of broken mental capacity, but that if they weren't taking certain medications, they wouldn't be able to function. And then from there, you can layer on top of that, never mind being able to meditate. So I have a number of people in my mind who I can apply that to, and I would agree with that. That sometimes we have to deal with the reality of samsara that we live in, and that's a requirement to help help someone take some paths on the step.
Yep.
Yep. So I think that's a good comment, John.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think people should not, bringing that medication thing up is a little tricky. And what I mean by that is that we can't avoid, in my opinion, in my own life experience, we shouldn't avoid medications. And John's example there is one that is why. I think that we live in a suffering existence, and suffering existence includes all kinds of suffering, including mental. And we're blessed to have medications, as imperfect as they are, and with the crazy side effects that they have, not to make a pun, I shouldn't have used the word crazy, but the very challenging side effects they have. The point is that it's a relative world we live in, and even the medications we have are part of mixed karma. They're good, but they're also bad. They're not ideal. And as we personally arise in our life situation, moment by moment, where we might need to take medication that's beneficial to us, it ain't perfect, and it isn't supposed to be, because we're living in samsara. But we could say all we want about pharmaceutical companies, et cetera, but there are people, scientists, who have the right motivation and intent, good karma, behind wanting to develop drugs that help people, and people taking them and the people who prescribe them. There's a lot of good karmic energy present there, including by those who take them because of what they want to do in terms of making progress. And we have to accept that and understand that. And know that it's part of what we can skillfully use if we're really good practitioners. But also it can be abused, and as much as we could avoid it, especially at the time of death, then it's something that we take into consideration. And as Megan was talking about earlier, it has to be done skillfully on a case-by-case basis. There is no blanket statement that His Holiness could make even that would apply to everyone. And we have to be gentle, kind, and wisdom-filled with every individual situation, and not be like, black and white about it. So I think that's all we have time for today. Any other questions people have? We can address them next week. Next week, we'll get into just finishing up like some of the practices we could do as we approach death. But then we'll get into actual practices we can do as we might be going through, and all of us eventually will be going through the actual death process, which could be very beneficial. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope I see you next week.
Thank you very much, John.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
Bye.